Jess Marie Johnson, PAB's Executive Director, and I'm joined by Jacqueline Hay, PAB's Associate Director. Thank you for joining us for the virtual workshop called Are You Learning What We're Teaching? A Student Learning Outcomes Assessment workshop. The PAB Criterion Student Learning Outcomes Assessment, which is now Criterion 4D in the 2022 standards, calls for a robust assessment of student learning wherein learning outcomes are identified, valid measures are developed and implemented, concrete results are reported, analyzed, and then used to inform the program's curriculum and teaching. The intent of this criterion is not to penalize programs for failure or less than optimal results from their assessments, but rather to see that the program is committed to continuous improvement and engaging in meaningful conversations on student learning, especially when an outcome or a competency is less than met based on the program's own benchmarks. Today's session will focus on how to develop an effective approach to assessing student learning, not only to fulfill programmatic and institutional accreditation requirements, but primarily as a means to strengthen the program, its curriculum, teaching, and the learning within the program. Our presenter extraordinaire, Laurie Goldman, was integral in the development and implementation of Tufts Student Learning Outcomes Assessment Plan, which PAB considers a notable practice and is available on the PAB website. Laurie Goldman is a senior lecturer and director of graduate studies in Tufts Department of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning, and she will be leading today's workshop. Throughout this session, Jacqueline and I will monitor the chat, so please feel free to add your questions in the chat. Now I'll turn over the session to Laurie. Thank you.
Terrific. It's great to see some familiar faces in the group, and I'm looking forward to really learning with you. Before I share my screen, I just want to say that the intent of this is really a workshop. And it's an interactive presentation. So my slides are really an invitation for you to put yourself and your thinking about your programs into the room and at the forefront of your mind. And I'll be prompting you throughout about what are ways that you can think about your own program. And I'm going to share my screen now so that have a guide to this. I get a heads up that I'm visible. My slides are visible. Excellent. And this didn't click properly. Terrific. So what I'm hoping you're going to gain from this time that we have together is a start on understanding what student learning objectives are, and how they can be meaningful and useful for you and your programs, and also feasible for us to do. Most of us are not doing this as our main thing in our departments. We are busy doing the important tasks of actually making learning happen, as well as research and activism in the field or whatever else we're doing. And so the intent here is to get us started on thinking about strategies for student learning assessment that will achieve those goals of being meaningful, useful, and feasible, and to consider some common challenges and what we can do about them, and to start thinking together about what you might actually do in your program with your colleagues and other stakeholders. And you'll leave here not with a complete design plan, but you'll leave here with some ideas about how to augment what you're already doing or how to get started. And the way we're going to do this is our flow of our conversation will start with questions about what student learning outcomes are and why they're important to assess. We'll consider which ones we should assess, and then I'm going to tell a story of UEP, or my Department of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning, of how we approached how are we going to measure student learning outcomes. And although it's been acknowledged as a noteworthy practice. It is far from perfect. We've abandoned some parts of it, which I'm not showing because they were too cumbersome. But what you're going to see is some good practice that could be better, and we're working on making it better. And it's an invitation to put yourself in our shoes and think about your process of designing what's going to work in your program. And that will guide us through how are we selecting what we're going to look at? How are we developing indicators and measurements? How are we doing the collecting and analyzing and interpreting? And how are we using the findings? We'll talk some about challenges, and we'll do some culminating exercise at the end of just getting started on what you're going to do in your programs. But I'm going to prompt you with things like that, activities like that, reflections like that throughout our time together. Starting now, and can we put in the chat the link to a Google Doc? So the Google Doc for the workshop that is there, if you click on that, you'll see Roman numeral 1 in the Google Doc. And what I'd like us to start with is what's really important to us in what our students are learning. What do we know in what we've seen our students doing in the past couple of years? If folks could list a few of the greatest gains we've seen in that first cluster of bullet points. If folks could list, what do we wish students had learned better than what we've seen? And then which are the most important signs of learning, some indications that it's happening? That's the third cluster. And you'll see that I've arranged the Google Doc so that folks who are at the beginning of the alphabet can start with the first cluster, those in the middle of the alphabet, the second cluster, and those in the end of the alphabet, the last cluster. That's just to avoid traffic if we have a lot of people here. You can add bullet points and you can add a plus sign if someone's already mentioned it. Great. Oh, these are terrific. You can go and check. I see some people are doing the pluses here. That's terrific. Just take another moment for this. So these are really terrific beginnings of this, and we can see and looking at them that a lot of these are really common across programs, and you're going to have ways that that they are distinctive to your own programs. Please keep these in mind as we're moving through the workshop. I'm going to go back to sharing. Great. So a lot of what we've put on that screen actually fits the definition of student learning outcomes. This is a standard, kind of obvious definition of student learning outcomes, clearly state the expected knowledge, skills, attitudes, competencies, habits of mind that students are expected to acquire at our institutions of higher learning. This is taken from the National Institute of Learning Outcomes Assessment. And it's clear from what we've already put in that screen that what we've put there of student outcomes are really desirable aspirations for what we're trying to do in our programs. And I wanted to lift up for us, what are some reasons for doing this? And feel free to put in the chat anything that's coming to mind that's either missing or maybe misconstrued in what I have here on the upcoming 2 slides. And we are doing it for external audiences. This is hosted by the Planning Accreditation Board. They ask us to do this in order for us to be accredited. Some of us also have other accreditors that require that we assess student learning outcomes. And we're doing it to assess for also university audiences that we're doing what we say we're doing and delivering what we say we're delivering. It's also important for our prospective employers to be able to hear what it is that a degree from our program signifies and to have something to substantiate that, as well as to prospective students. And we don't always share that information in the same way, but in order for us to communicate that, we have to do the assessment and have that information available. That's what today's workshop is to help us think about. We're doing that for ourselves as well. We can assess student outcomes to inform how are we going to improve our current curriculum or our pedagogy, how we're doing our teaching for learning. We can do that in order to celebrate and preserve and replicate what we're doing well in some domains, in some types of courses, in some types of learning activities, and bring them into other kinds of learning that we're doing. We can also use it to see if we are able to better align what we're teaching and how we're teaching with what is changing in our field. What are we hearing about the needs of our employers or the needs of our communities? And are we actually still doing that, or do we need to do it differently in our programs, in our courses? We might change things. We might assess so that we can make changes based on changes in our student cohorts. Are our student bodies more diverse? Does that mean diverse in terms of backgrounds, in terms of past competency development, in terms of different interests and focus areas? Are we accommodating that? If we assess well, we'll be able to discern that and to discern how we can make those changes effectively. Again, changes in the field is another reason we might want to assess to see if we are and in what ways we are aligning ourselves with those changes. So I wanted, so are there any comments in the, anything I left out, about reasons to do this? Or any comments came up about that? Very good, okay. And you can think about your own reasons. So I want to make some distinctions between what student learning outcomes are and other really important things that we might assess. Not because assessing student learning outcomes is the most important, but because we are invited by the PAB to do this important task, I want to help us understand what specifically is meant by student learning outcomes. So the first distinction to make is that student learning outcomes are about students. They're about what our students are doing in order to learn. So that's different from assessment we might do about our programs overall, the kinds of courses that we offer, the ways we do pedagogy, studio courses, practicum courses, independent projects. That's program level assessment. We want to do that too. We also assess our faculty and the quality of our faculty, their ability to do teaching as well as research. That's not student, it's important, but it's not student learning outcomes. And we do a lot about assessing courses as a whole. We have course evaluations, important, vital to improving our work, but that's different from student learning outcomes. We also want to focus on learning, on what it is that we want them to know as they finish our courses and finish our program, the skills that they'll develop and refine, the values, sensibilities, habits of mind that they'll be attuned to and know how to recognize and know how to live into, prioritize when they're in the field working with colleagues who maybe haven't been through our programs. That's different from other kinds of outcomes like retention and graduation rates. Important, but different from student learning outcomes. Pertain to students, but not their learning specifically. Student and alumni satisfaction is also different from what they're actually learning. Employment rates, types of positions they obtain, service to the profession, all really important products of their having learned with us. But when we're talking about student learning outcomes, we're really trying to focus on the learning itself. And we're trying to focus on the outcomes of that learning. What is it that they've internalized that they can then apply in practice? A lot of you in our initial prompt mentioned a lot of things like this that are about how much they've learned and how well they can use what they've learned in practice. We want to identify gaps in their knowledge and skills and sensibilities, and identify what's really distinctive about what they're learning and be able to communicate that. That's quite different from all other important things we can assess, such as the inputs into their learning, what we are assigning for them to read, the kinds of deliverables they're doing in our courses or in our culminating projects. Whether they've completed the work, have they gone through the different milestones and loopholes that we've set for them. Our faculty's efforts to improve are also really important for us to be paying attention to, but we're focusing on student learning assessment on what the students are learning themselves. I'm also making somewhat of a distinction between what they have learned and those outcomes and longer term impacts of the learning, such as what they're doing with their learning. Those are really important, and we do want to trace those in other ways. I'm making a caveat here that is that when we are looking at student learning outcomes, we could do that in a number of ways. We could focus on signs that they have attained a skill level, that they've internalized knowledge, all of those things that are listed on the left side of this slide. And we can do that in a way that says, we see that they are mastering these. There's evidence of that. And we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about what it might be the evidence of their actually internalizing those knowledge, developing those skills, attaining those sensibilities. There's a different question of how do we attribute that learning to what we're doing in our courses and the other ways that students learn while they're in our programs. The attribution question that as an evaluator I'm very interested in is, how do we claim credit for it as opposed to what they came with or what they got as a result of something else that's happening in their lives or in our world, in our society, in our communities. That's an important question that you might want to think about, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time in helping us address that attribution challenge. I'm going to focus on what we can do in order to discern whether they are actually having that knowledge, developing those skills, attuning themselves to those sensibilities. I'm going to pause to see if there are any questions about that. And in that pause, this is a prompt for the chat. You give some thought to what are you already doing in your programs to assess student learning in the way that we've defined it. Give some thought to that. Put some examples in the chat. And give some thought to whether what it is that we're already doing in our programs fit that delineation of student learning outcomes that we just went through in those slides. They're focused on students, on what they're learning, on the actual outcomes. You can put some of that in the chat. I'm going to stop the share for a moment. Great. Evaluation of capstone reports, comprehensive exams. Oh, I'm looking forward to hearing about that, Susan. Alumni surveys, yeah, listening sessions. Yeah, Anne is pointing out that these are not mutually exclusive. We can absolutely have assessments that deal with all of those levels. An assignment of a course, the entire curriculum, all of that is quite, what happens with employers, it's an and rather than an or kind of situation. Great. Professional Advisory Committee reports. Yeah, great. These are really wonderful, and I'll look forward to looking at them in greater depth later. Go back to sharing my screen. So we've got a lot of ideas about how to assess. We're going to return to that in a moment. I want us to take a moment to think about, when we've listed what our priorities are, what criteria might we use about where we're going to drill down and focus our efforts. We can focus on external requirements like the PAB standards and expectations for the field. And we want to focus on what's important to students, faculty, employers, and communities. A lot of what is mentioned in the chat just now could be input into what it is that we're going to assess of our student learning, what we've gained from looking at those reports, what we're hearing in the listening sessions, what we know from surveys of our students and our employers, or those who are supervising internships that our students are involved in. We want to look at our own priorities and our strategic plan. We want to focus on where there's room for improvement and where we know that it's feasible for us to make changes because we have the resources for that, or we think that we can get the resources for that. And we want to focus on those that apply to all of our students. And I think that will become apparent as we move along, what all of our students mean. With those in mind, we're going to go to the next activity, which is number 2 in the Google chat. So in the Google Doc, and I'm going to stop the share so that you can take a look at that. Can everybody see the Google Doc? Number 2, number 2 in the Google Doc. Can people wiggle around if you're seeing that? Number 2, okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm opening up breakout rooms for you to populate the 3 categories of knowledge, skills, and guiding values or principles And in your group, if you can put some student learning outcomes in each of those, list as many as possible, and then think about the ones that are most important to you. I'm going to open the breakout rooms for you to do this now, and we'll take a few minutes, like maybe three to 4 minutes to do this in the groups. It sounds like people have a lot there, and I hope that's helping you really start to think about what you're going to be prioritizing in your learning assessments plan. Now we're going to go through, I'm sharing my screen again, and we're going to talk about how, sorry for the clutter here. We're going to talk about some of the measurements for these strategies that we've just for the learning outcomes that we've just specified. And often accreditors and others who are imparting wisdom about good assessment of learning outcomes, student learning outcomes, are encouraging us to focus on direct measures as opposed to indirect measures. So direct measures are ones that are what students are actually doing that is tangible, visible evidence that they have internalized the knowledge and developed the skills or have those sensibilities, as opposed to what is observed, what is reported, or opinions about whether that learning has happened, or reflections about whether the student themselves feels that they have attained that knowledge, or someone else is discerning and rating in retrospect whether they think that's happened. The direct observation in some way of whether that learning has happened and whether we're seeing that evidence of that is a direct measure. A lot of what we listed initially in the chat about things we're doing would be classified as indirect measures. They're reports of what it is that we think students are learning. Those are tremendously valuable, but they're not the same as direct measurements. So I'm going to go through a little bit about these distinctions, so we'll have them in our mind. Sometimes the distinction is blurry. So here are some examples of direct measures of student learning outcomes. They could be embedded in our courses. Papers or other assignments show the evidence of what students have done, and we can use criteria that assess them there. We had some of this in our chat. As do exam questions, oral presentations. Those are all things we do in our courses that are observed evidence of learning having happened or learning in the process of happening. Culminating projects like thesis or other capstones, qualifying examinations. I saw those in the chat too initially. We also have exams that are not course connected. Ones that some programs develop of exit exams or pre and post exams. I have yet to see one of these. And so if somebody has them, I would love to see an example of, let's test them before they come, and let's test them at the end and compare. Just from my own experience, I cannot imagine our faculty in our department being able to agree on what those measures should be, or how we would analyze them. So I'm really eager to hear of any examples like that. We could also think of the AICP exam that many of our students take as being an example of a direct measure. If we look at particular question clusters, that's another possibility. Although not all of our students, at least in my program, it's a minority of students actually take the exam. And of course, they're not doing that immediately immediately after they're learning. They need to wait some before they actually do that, even if they're in an accredited program. So what's an example of indirect? We've already mentioned a few of those, like the student and alumni surveys or focus groups, or those listening sessions that some of you mentioned in the chat. Course grades are examples of indirect, that they don't distinguish enough about what it is that the students are actually learning, from what is happening in the course in general. We can't hone in on particular criteria about particular competencies or desired learning outcomes. They have other factors that are included in the overall course grade as well, like participation. So we want to maybe take those into account because they can alert us to what we might focus on and where we want to, which courses deserve our attention. Ones where there are low averages or a wide range of grades might alert us. We've got to pay attention to here. There's something we need to learn about improving what's happening in those courses. So it's important to look at those, but it's not the same. Similarly, we could also look at awards and fellowships and honors our students have, because they illustrate what are great potential accomplishments. Thinking about what it is that we've done in our courses, in our other parts of our curriculum that made that possible, might help us think about what we might want to focus on to figure out what is it we're doing right, that we might want to amplify. So all of these other things that we're doing can help us inform what we're going to focus on for direct measures of student learning outcomes. There are also some things that we do that involve both direct and indirect measures, such as our examples of using an internship and what supervisors of an internship or the students themselves report about the internship. So it's a reported measure because we're not usually watching them do the internship directly, but they're so linked to what the activities are in the internship. We might also be asking them about those activities, that we could think about them as direct measures in some sense as well. The idea of having student portfolios that lift up what it is that students have done in our courses, their capstones, their internships, other things they may be doing in the communities that they're working in. Those are other ways of thinking about direct measures that might also include the students' reflection on what it is that they'll do. I'll return to this at least briefly later on in the workshop. We can also use those reflections as raw materials and code them as data, as another way of adding to our material of observations. I'll say something about case studies and critical learning experiences later on.
There are some two questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
I'll start from the bottom up. The first one was, and I think you've answered this, but if we're looking for evidence of personal and leadership skills, wouldn't surveys of employers be a direct measure for these topics? And the next one is, can you provide an example of a direct measure that would be used to assess one of the values, such as, or habits of mind?
Yeah.
These seem challenging to measure directly.
I agree with all of those. So for the first one, yeah, as I just mentioned, and I'll show some examples of that, we absolutely want to have confer with employers or other community partners and all of this. they can also be those who are doing direct measures, right? So our way of, that's why I listed them as hybrid. We're not doing it, the observation directly, but the internship supervisors are, at least hopefully they are. The students are doing a direct observation too. They're observing what they've done. And so I would review those as direct measures as well, and they're very important. As for looking at direct measures of values, I think that is very challenging to actually measure. And I will point to a few things that we do in rubrics for our student assignments in a few classes that I think very imperfectly get at that. And so maybe that would be an area that I would love to have a group maybe that stems from this workshop. Maybe the PAB can help us do that, of a working group that might help us think more about how to do that, especially in light of our polarized times where a lot of us are spending time talking about those values and how to put them into practice in ways that we haven't done so purposefully and extensively as we have in recent years. So I think it would be really valuable to have a working group on that. Did I cover them?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So I'm going to go back to the slides. Oh, I'm still on the slides. Sorry. Here I am. I'm still here. So I'm just putting this out here as what are different types of metrics for assessing, for measuring the indicators for those observations that we have. I'm not going to go into this in depth because we're researchers. We deploy a lot of these tools as researchers that we bring to our learning assessment as well. We can muster the research skills of our colleagues, even those who are not officially charged with student learning outcomes assessment. They can be partners in our strategies of doing our student learning assessment. Either comprehensively or with respect to particular design elements, or with respect to analyzing some of what it is that we do. I'd like now for us to actually work on a couple of these. We are now, how many are we now? Could people wiggle around if meeting with that group felt like it was a good thing to do? I'm seeing a little bit wiggling or thumbs up. I'm going to put into the slide, into the chat, or actually you have on your Google Doc, if you go to number 3 of the Google Doc, there is a link to a slide, a Google slide that will make it easier, I think, for you to fill it in the column as opposed to using the table many people at once. How many groups did we have? Let me get back. I'm going to stop the share. This is going to help.
I believe we had 8 before. We now have 30.
Yeah, I think that using the Google slide is going to be easier than everybody using the table at the same time. Up to you. If you click on that link to the Google slide, pick the slide that corresponds to your breakout room. And I'm going to open the breakout room now. I think the instructions are pretty self-explanatory. I've asked you to pick 1 or 2 learning outcomes that are common to people in your group. Write them down in the first column, 1 or 2 of those, and then think about what assignment, what kind of observable, something that the student has done, you could use to discern whether and in what respect and in what way they're actually learning that. And then in the third column, list some possible measurement mechanisms, indicators, metrics that you might use for that. This is just to get a beginning of a taste of that and get it into your mind about what you might do. And then I'm going to give you some more examples after that. Any questions before I open the breakout room? And I'll give you about 10 minutes, maybe 7 minutes to do this for a while. Any questions before I open the breakout rooms? Were people able to get to the slides? Yeah, Esteban?
Yeah, I have a question. You know, when we talk about direct measures, you know, you listed papers, exams, oral examination, community projects, and you talked about ways of assessing those so we can measure them. But then, you know, if we have, for example, you know, a paper and the student gets an A in the paper, we cannot use the course grade or the paper grade because that will be an indirect measure. So what would be an example of a direct measure on a direct?
Okay, I love that this came up already. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen and I'm going to just give a little teaser of one of the things that we do. And then we'll go into a greater depth about the process before we do this exercise that we have right now. So hold on one more moment. I'll reshare my screen. There, we got it. So this is an example of a rubric that in our department we have introduced as a way of engaging leveraging course assignments for communicating to students how well they're learning with respect to each competency, each desired learning outcome. And the criteria that we're using to say to what extent have they developed proficiency with respect to each of those learning outcomes. We developed this drawing some from a values framework that I have in the materials for this workshop as a link for you to use that have samples of these kinds of rubrics. It could be that several of you use something like this in your courses already to grade and give feedback on assignments. So what we do is we have each of the criteria, and there are many for each assignment of these criteria that relate to these core competencies. And then we articulate what is the criteria. This is one from a course that is essentially our planning theory course. And one of the things that we're really trying to focus on in that course is developing our students' ability to do critical reasoning and understand the components of critical reasoning. That there are other criteria as well. This slide is focused on those criteria. And you can see that we have, for example, the articulation of this central argument of the debate. And then we've highlighted these in different ratings for each of those criteria. What does it mean to be exemplary, competent, only partly competent, or not yet competent? So it will say you clearly and concisely articulate the argument and explain why it's contestable and significant, whereas only partially competent means not as clearly or concisely as you might have. Partly competent is less clear and less concise, and they didn't articulate a contestable argument. We have these for many different, I think there are like 12 or 13 for each assignment. And we're able then to drill down on what it is that really matters and communicate that with the student. And I'll show a little bit about how we operationalize that when we come back. So then we have assessment of each of those criteria, not for the assignment as a whole, but for each of these criteria, or maybe clusters of them together. Is that more palpable?
I hate to yell, but I put a comment in the chat, and like I use these for all my classes, right? But are you saying that you but we're not allowed to use our class grades or our class grading for this? So are you saying that you do two rubrics, one where you grade and one where you use the
No. It's the same. So
well, then why are they telling us we have to do something that we can't use the class grading?
No, I would, well, I'm not sure I'm not concerned about the they here, I'm concerned about the us. So the final grade for the course is different from the grade on an assignment, which could be a way of doing it, a grade on an assignment, which is different from the grade from an entire course. What we do with these rubrics, and maybe actually I'll skip over that exercise and go through what it is that we've done. And I think that will help for this. I think that will actually be helpful. So I'll just make a comment to respond to what Anne is saying now, and then I'll tell you a little bit about our journey of how we got there. So what we do is, as opposed to saying, what is the course grade for those assignments, which is one way of doing it, we want to know more in a more refined way. How are our students doing with respect to a lot of the criteria that go into the grade for our for an assignment? So many of us, when we're doing grading for assignments as it is, we have criteria that we use. That's how we do the grade. We're using this rubric way as a good way for us to communicate with our students about how we're assessing what it is that they're doing. This is this rubric that I had on the screen before, and I'll show you some more of that, is actually what we use in the grading process and giving students feedback. We give it to the student, and we use it in order to determine the grade for that assignment. And then we have used that same thing, not extra work. We've already done it. We then analyze that for our assessment. So it's not extra work for us. We've already done it in the semester where we were giving the student feedback. So instead of using the global grade for the course or the global grade for a particular assignment, we're actually honing in on the criteria that we're using to get to the grade for the assignment, and we're saving it. And we're saving it in a way that it makes it easy for us to then capture and aggregate and then use in order to answer questions like, how are they progressing from not just one assignment to the next in a single course, but how do we look at it over several cohorts, or what are trends that we're seeing in our learning over several cohorts? What are we seeing in changes from one course that they take in the first semester to a course that they take in their second semester? And if we use similar kinds of criteria, we're able to do that. And it's not extra work in the data collection because we've done it. It's only extra work in the data analysis, which is not minimal, but the data collection has already been done. Anna, have I answered that question?
You have. I just like, it sounds an astounding amount of work. I'm just trying to think our whole grading system would have to change, like to do that long term.
And I'm gonna,
like, it's not minimal work to do that analysis. I really respect you having done it, but this is. And then across, like, even if we look at, say, first semester studio versus second semester studio, they're different faculty. They might grade a little differently.
Yep.
That's just saying that, yes.
I completely agree. And I'm going to tell us the UEP story in a second. Me, did you have something you wanted to ask too?
Yeah, but I think, thank you. But I think someone raised a hand before me.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't want to jump the line. Yeah.
I did, but I lowered it again. My question was answered.
Okay.
Yeah, so my question is, are you saying that when we grade each assignment, are you suggesting that when we grade each assignment, we sort of incorporate PAB criteria into our rubric when we grade each assignment? So that it might become easier for us when whatever, to show that to integrate teaching, grading, and student learning outcome assessment.
I'm not going to say what you should do, because you know so much better what you should do than I do. I'm just going to tell you what we did. And I'll show you the story of how we developed this. And we didn't only look at the PAB standards, we used our own. And we don't do this for every course. We only do it for selected courses. And we found that it's actually quite helpful in, well, let me actually tell you the story of how we got to this. And I certainly don't think everybody has to do this. And the concerns that Anne raised about inter-rater reliability are very significant. Well, I think it will be helpful if we look at how this evolved together and keep asking the questions, and we'll address them along the way. Does that make sense to folks? But those are really important concerns. And I just want to underscore that I am not claiming that this is the best way to do it. It is time consuming. As somebody who has developed a lot of this and does this, I have found that it actually makes it a lot easier to talk with students about what it is that we're working together with them to help them develop. It has, for me, in my experience, it's made me able to be in greater partnership with students in the class about owning responsibility for the learning and doing it intentionally. But you're going to do that in a way that works for you and your colleagues. This is just what we've experimented with. And I would love to hear about other experiments that are less onerous, or it's not actually that onerous once you get started with it. And in fact, it actually does save time in a lot of ways, because and I'll show you how we use our learning management system to do it, is that it's a way to give detailed feedback to the student by just clicking on something instead of typing it out. And then we have ways of adding specific comments to it as well. So it can actually save a lot of time, because you're communicating in a robust way in sentences to students about their work, but you only click. And so it's a lot of work at the beginning, but then you can use it again and again with only tweaking it, unless more than a tweak proves necessary. Any more questions before I start telling the story of how we came up with this scary, but understandably and justifiably scary thing? Okay, I'm going to go back to the, am I still sharing? No. Okay.
I actually do have a question. This is Noah Durst. I put it in the chat, but
okay, I didn't see the chat. Yeah.
And I can just expand on it briefly. My question is whether there are measures that have been tested and validated that we could use as a guide. And I asked this question having been a public school teacher, and a couple decades ago, I remember being asked by my training organization to develop independent measures. And my recollection of what happened across that institution was that people, it's very easy to create a measure that's easy to succeed at. And I guess I'm concerned that I think it's very important that we know whether we're successfully teaching, whether our students are learning skills and building the knowledge they need to acquire. But I wonder to what extent will widespread adoption and implementation of assessment measures achieve that goal if we're not capable or aware of the appropriate measures to use and how to assess them.
Absolutely. And so I've just put in the chat. Oh, the link to this didn't show up in the chat, but I'll put it, it's in some materials that you're going to get from us later. The hyperlink didn't translate into the chat. What we did was we used this a very large, robust set of values rubrics that the American Association of Colleges and Universities put together. And they had a team of people who developed rubrics that are similar to the ones that the one that I just showed you, for a lot of different learning competencies. And we studied, they developed those, they tested them, they did a whole bunch of things in order to discern that these are actually good measures of those particular competencies. We spent a bunch of time within our faculty tweaking them, changing them, adding to them, not just tweaking, changing them to fit our version of planning, and in our case also policy for those for each of those competencies. And it would be great if we had another working group that worked on further refining those and testing those in ways that are really drilling down on what we care about in planning. I would love to do that, particularly for the values-oriented one, as we mentioned earlier. They have ones that address values that obviously they're not thinking about planning because it's across many different disciplines. So I agree that that's an important thing to do. And what we're also doing is experimenting with that. And the more we experiment and share with that, then the easier it will be to actually have this be useful, and it will also be easier to operationalize.
Laurie, just in the interest of time, it would be great if maybe you can share your story, and then we can take questions
Great.
a little bit later.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, let me get rid of the chat for now. What we did was we started by looking at our curriculum map. I know that these are not required anymore for our self-study reports, but we had a map that had the PAB competencies and our competencies that we added or refined to that. And we listed which of our core courses are we doing each of these, and the ones that are really important. And then we highlighted the ones that we thought were really important for us to assess, either because they're so fundamental to what it is that planning, that our planning school is trying to do, what is distinctive to our program, and where we know our students are most struggling and we need to pay attention to. And we identified which of those competencies we were going to focus our student learning outcomes assessment on for each of the core courses. And we chose the core courses because, one, those are core courses that are designed to hit on these learning competencies, but also because those are the courses that all of our students are required to take. And so we know that we're getting at all of the students, as opposed to other things that are other learning outcomes that are happening in electives, which are also really important to assess, but we have scarce assessment resources, so we can't assess every single course that we're teaching. We were only going to focus on a few courses, and we put most of our energy on assessing just a few of our core courses, or all of our core courses. One is still in progress. So we picked those, and we started with one course, our course that's called Cities in Space, Place, and Time, which is a course that focuses on the history of the built environment, and it's also a kind of intellectual history of the field of planning, and has some elements also of planning theory in it as well. And we're also working on some competencies that relate to critical analysis and writing in that course as well. And what we did was we focused on 2 of the core assignments in that course, and we developed a set of 12 criteria that are related to that course. And we made a rubric similar to the one that I just showed you for a different course. And then we sort of developed a system for reporting and tracking it. So I'm going to show you a little bit of that and then some other examples. So the first thing that my colleague who devised this did was she looked at what is happening in that course already. How were they already in this course, trying to teach, to inspire learning about those competencies, those desired learning outcomes that we said we were trying to do in that course. And this is what that colleague presented to the rest of the faculty of her effort to see, this is what we're trying to do. And she wrote the competency, and then this was what her assessment was of what they were trying to do for each of those. I'm not going to go through each of these slides, but you could see that she's hit on a lot of them and then said, this is the thing that's actually happening in our classroom. So she did that for general planning knowledge. How is it that we're looking at planning law, where we're exploring these laws, et cetera, these ordinances in which planning is occurring. How we're looking at understanding the future for each of these, and also for the planning skills, and for values and ethics. So here's an example of we frame around professional ethics of responsibility. Here is how they are operationalizing the discussion of the different codes of ethics. Those are examples of how she did that. So after doing all of that and really looking at, we say that these competencies are associated with what it is that we're doing in that class. What are we actually already doing in our class? And then what the realization is we really do think we are doing those things. We have been doing those things. But how do we know that they're actually learning those? Led to the realization that the previous assessment of the assignments was largely looking at, did they write a good paper? And leaning more on their writing skills and their communication skills than actually each of those criteria of what it is that we were trying to actually do in the course. That was the observation of the conclusion of having done that review of what are we trying to do and how are we doing it in that course. And that led to a decision that this faculty member made of looking at the assignments again and really making it clear and in a purposeful, transparent way to the faculty and the students, how are they doing each of those criteria? She emphasized using Bloom's taxonomy of learning actions when she was thinking about that. Describe, relate, reflect. And she created this rubric similar to the one that I showed you before, where she had in this column of the component a clear directive around those verbs of learning related verbs. And then what does it look like to be doing that for those different perspectives for each element of 2 assignments? So she created those related to what is actually happening in those assignments. Used it as the way, as a template for giving feedback to the student, printed those, had it in a Word document and dragged this circle around to show the student, here's what you did, here are the points you got, you were this high, this level, that level. Sometimes it overlapped her criteria and she put the circle in the middle. And that was really good in her assessment for really seeing where did we end up in terms of the ratings for each of those 12 criteria for each assignment. Then came, how do we report this in aggregate? And it was very difficult for me the person who did that, to do that based on the way she had organized those criteria. And so I did that somewhat differently in the course that I showed you previously. What we affirmed was we really can see what they've learned. We're seeing that because we're looking at the ratings for each of those criteria. And we could aggregate that over time. We could aggregate that by the different criteria for the different assignments for each semester. Although that was somewhat challenging because some of the criteria overlapped. As you saw, sometimes the circle spanned several different things. So a subsequent colleague who took over that course after this instructor had retired developed a different system of separating out the criteria so that it's easier to just make a check mark, and used Canvas, our learning management system, to automatically cluster the related criteria and then create a distribution. Here it's in pie charts of how many are at each level that in minutes generated this. So if we use our learning management tools for this, we can cut down on at least the first level of analysis of the data, as opposed to just and then leave our thinking power to the interpretation. I'm going to show you another example from that course that I just taught, or that I just showed you. Excuse me. The rubric that I just showed you came from a different course where we did have only one criterion in each row. That made it easier for us to do that aggregation of the responses. So I showed you this already. This is what it looks like in our in the rubric that the student sees and that we use in order to assess the assignment using our learning management system called Canvas. So all we're doing is clicking on the rubric. Looks pretty much the same on Canvas, and then we click on what level it is. This student, we clicked on competent for these two criteria. The student could click on this hyperlink and see the whole explanation. They see the comment. We didn't have to type it out. It was already there. We just had to click on it. But then we also could write a comment. This is a fabulous start. I think framing what you have at the bottom of page 5 articulates the argument you seek to assess based on the research. So we can add the specific comments to it all in one place. Here's another example from other parts of that same rubric. And at the end, we were easily able to assemble all of that and aggregate it for the entire semester, or you could do this for multiple semesters. And so here we can look over the entire cohort. This is how they rated in terms of exemplary to not yet competent for each of those clusters of criteria. And we could do that for different assignments. So here you see reasons and underlying assumptions, evidence critique, attributed versus normative claims in that assignment. Here it is for another assignment in that same course where there are somewhat similar criteria, but it's a different assignment directed to a different audience of policy planning audiences, of people who are influential for taking action. And we see from this that our students are better at using the supported evidence than they are in somewhat better in aggregate of using the supported evidence than they are in critiquing it. So we're able to look at that and then think, okay, what can we do in order to boost the critiquing as well as the using the evidence? We were also able to compare what is it that they were doing in the over the course, because for that first assignment, that initial excerpt of a rubric that I showed you earlier, we had a draft and then we had a final version. So this showed the aggregate scores for the draft compared to the aggregate scores for the final. And we can see that regarding evidence critique, over the course of the semester, more students fell into the exemplary category and fewer students fell into the partially or the not yet competent categories. So we have these measures to look at. We also, and then we could use that, and we've used what we're learning, particularly looking at writing. That was one of our places where our students struggle, and we use that evidence to get resources to pay our writing consultants connected with the Writing Center to do a pilot study of a mandatory consultation with all of those students to work on their writing skills. Not something we had the resources to do, but because we had the data to show that our students needed this, we were able to secure university resources to supplement our budget so that we could have that resource for our students. We also changed, we added an assignment in order to work on the critical analysis skills based on what we saw that these problems were persisting over time. We used this analysis to see, did we see changes over time? As Anne indicated, it's really challenging to do that quantitatively because of questions of inter-rater reliability. We did a lot of conferring about what we mean by the criteria, and those detailed descriptions of what each level means written out helps us get to inter-rater reliability. So each semester we review one or a few assignments together of the people who are doing that grading and compare, are we all on the same page about what this means? It's not perfect, but it helps in making sure we're able to have some degree of consistency in how we're using those. We also, it's hard to look over time also because so much happened during that time span. We had the pandemic, our class size increased very precipitously during that time. We also switched learning management systems and we're doing it in a different way. We had a couple of faculty who were reluctant to use the rubrics and use the management system. And so it's imperfect, but I think what we got out of it, even with it being imperfect, was we started having conversations about what the students were learning and not learning exceptionally well and learning less well. And that is the payoff. So you could do this in a much more simplified way. And the power of it is you're able to look at it in a way in aggregate and talk about it and link it to something that is tangible and have conversations about it. So I think that's the gain from it. We also have done similar, used similar pieces of the rubric so that we're able to look at those same competencies, those same particular criteria across several assignments. So we can compare the assignments in one course to what they're doing, say, for example, in their thesis or their capstone at the end of the year, and look at that over time. As Anne says, right now we're trying to sort, I'm not showing you that because we're still dealing with some of the inter-rater reliability issues and people actually turning in their rubrics for their thesis, the faculty actually doing that. But it has the fact that we are doing it has allowed us to have conversations that led, for example, to the introduction of a new thesis design course that we didn't have before that really works on some of those criteria that we saw were lacking because we were doing that careful assessment. We also decided to have thesis awards and an exemplary thesis bank where we show and communicate with students about the particular aspects of what was great that is often lacking in some of the theses, so that they're seeing it and we're pointing to it more explicitly. I talked about having additional writing supports already. So I just want to show a couple of other ways that we've done this to show the variety of it. So for our economics course, what we used was, rather than a paper, what we did was point to key competencies that are on exams, the midterm and the final exam. And the instructor of that course pointed to particular exam questions that are repeated. They're not always the same exact question, of course, but there are always exam questions that address particular competencies. And so each semester that the course is offered, the TAs record take the spreadsheet that they use for their grading of the assignments and indicate what are the points for each of those correct answers or incorrect answers or partially correct answers, and then that allows us to get the aggregate scores just using simple Excel sheet. For particular exam questions that correspond to the core competencies that we're trying to focus on in that course. Is there a question about this? This one? Okay. And then we do something similar for our field projects course, which is teams working with a community partner. And here we do the assessment for the team as a whole. And it's what you have here is a similar rubric. And in this case, they have an Excel sheet that has that. This is a screenshot of the Excel sheet, and they highlight the level here, similar explaining it, and give it to the student. And the highlight is a product of the instructor's evaluation, the TA's evaluation, the student's self-reporting, and what they heard from the community partner, and the faculty member clicks on those parts of the rubric and uses that to determine the grade for the course. So again, it saves on the not having to write anything out because you're clicking, not having to write out as much because they're clicking, and then they have additional comments on the side. And that similarly allows us to aggregate it. We do it just by saying what portion of the teams exhibited which level of mastery for each criterion. And we can look at that over time. And when we have a lot of this, we're able to say which types of field projects were higher or lower. We haven't had that conversation yet, but we could do that. Any questions about this before I'm going to say a little bit about surveys that we've used before? No questions. Is there anything more, Jesmarine or Jacqueline?
No, there's nothing in the chat. So
we've done, we talked earlier about using surveys, and I want to show you how we did it, how we used surveys for assessing student learning outcomes with our internship. So we have one survey that students fill out that asks them, among other things, that we ask them about what their goals were, and we ask them about whether they would recommend that future students do an internship in that organization, for example. But we also asked them about a cluster of student learning outcomes or competencies that we're hoping that all students are gaining from internships. And we asked them to assess themselves in one survey at the end of the internship. How confident were you in being able to use that skill before the internship? And how confident are you in your ability to use that, exercise that skill after the workshop, after the internship? And you see here the difference between red is before the internship, purple is after the internship. And we see more students rated themselves extremely confident after as opposed to before. This is in effectively managing project tasks. This is another one that we used of collecting and organizing information or data. And then we asked similar kinds of questions to their supervisors. And here is an aggregate. This is an aggregate over several years. About being able to work. I just lifted up a few of these, and we had more of these. Working independently and meeting deadlines, or here's this one again, managing project tasks. Dark green is clearly ready for professional practice, and the lower end of the spectrum, the brown, is not ready for professional practice. And what you see here are some slides that I prepared for a discussion we had in the faculty that helped us think about what's happening in our internships, and also for us to think some about whether what we're doing in terms of quantitative and qualitative analysis, that is being perceived by internship supervisors. And we wanted to see whether that's been changing over time, and it wasn't changing as much as we thought it might be. In fact, we saw a slight increase in quantitative preparedness over time that we discussed in the faculty meeting, to what extent that might be a balancing out of adding more electives in that area to what we've been observing in our classes, on our statistics classes and other classes that are quantitative, that students are struggling more. So this doesn't definitively point to an answer. What this did was help us have a richer discussion in the faculty about where we're making progress and what's working and what's not working. So it's not a, here we do this and then we know, it's we do this and we have a more robust conversation.
Laurie, there's a question about that survey. The survey for internship conducted only once at the end of the internship, even though you were asking some questions before and after.
Yes, and there's a reason for that. The reason I often use this retrospective assessment in evaluations where there's a chance that in this case the student is going to understand what it means to have mastery, to have proficiency, or to be confident in doing that. Their understanding of what the task entails, what the skill entails, changes over the course of the internship, or it changes over the course of their participation in your program. And so if we ask them retrospectively, how do you think you were before? And then we ask them, how do you think you are now after the internship? Then we're holding constant what that student is thinking at that time, because we're asking them about that at the same time. We actually use the same technique in our mandatory exit survey, where we ask students about several of the core competencies that we care about in the exit survey that they're required to complete in order to get their diploma. And so we do a similar kind of analysis of retrospective self-assessment of before they come to our program and after they're done, that allows us to do the same sort of analysis. And it's pretty easy to do that. It would be much harder for us to muster the resources to get to monitor, are they actually completing the survey before and after. We actually did try to do this at multiple points of time, of asking students to reflect on here we had this student reflection idea that some programs, perhaps people here on the Zoom are doing this. I was really impressed with what I saw at University of New Mexico's planning program, where they have a mid-program self-assessment and discussion with a faculty advisor, followed by a program assessment at the final capstone, and looking at having a discussion with the student about how their learning has evolved and progressed. We tried to do that in our department, and although there is anecdotal evidence of it being very useful in a few cases, it proved much too cumbersome for us to do on a regular basis, cumbersome for us as faculty, cumbersome for the students. And once we changed our learning management system, we decided to abandon it because we just couldn't do it. We couldn't do it. It was valuable where it worked, but we couldn't maintain it. So we decided not to do it. For some of you, this will be instead of what we did, and that could be great. It's reported, but you could also link it to more concrete things. So for example, I did an assessment for one of our other programs, for our mid-career programs that's not PAB accredited. And one of the things we wanted to know in that is, are those mid-career students actually in learning from their work experience? Are they taking their work experience as learning material and then leveraging it for their own learning and potentially the learning of their classmates? And so I collected assignments that they had done where they said, we did this. So had multiple embedded critical case studies, and I coded them to see where that was happening. And then I shared my analysis with a focus group, and we discussed what techniques of leveraging work experience were helpful for their learning, and in what ways, and how might we devise assignments or create opportunities for doing more leveraging of learning from work experience in the future. So that was another type of strategy. Another thing is comprehensive exams pre-post. We mentioned that earlier. We have something that we call a capstone exam, but it's not the same as actually a comprehensive exam that you're actually asking students to, all students answer the same type of questions that test them on a variety of knowledge and skills and values competencies. We do that somewhat differently, and I'm happy to talk about what we've learned from that, but it could be that somebody here does somebody do this comprehensive exam? I saw that in the chat initially. If you could unmute and say a little bit about that, that would be awesome. If you're still here. Yes, Susan.
We at Iowa State have just, we're still, it's still a bit of a trial, to tell you the truth. But we've put together a comprehensive exam. It's linked to all of our core classes. So the faculty that teach our core classes, there's 6 core classes, they have put together and we've got like a question bank that we use. We actually use Canvas for the students to take the exam. It's modeled on the AICP exam, so it's a multiple choice. They have a time limit. They have to answer 80 questions that are randomly selected, right, using Canvas and the question banks. It has 2 parts. So one part is indeed the multiple choice, and then they have a like short, I'm going to call it short essays, but they're kind of short paragraphs. So they're given 4 questions. They have to do 3, so they have a choice, and write on those. And those are also randomly selected, right? So we have a question bank on those, and they're all tied to the core classes. And then our individual faculty that did made up the questions and teach those classes, they do the grading. So I mean, at least for the essay questions, the multiple choice, of course, are already Canvas grades those for us. So I mean, it's a way to do it pretty quickly.
Can you share with us more about how did you as a faculty get to, how did you agree on, how did you reach consensus about what to include?
Well, we know, I mean, we kind of did a little bit like what you did, I guess, in that we focused on the curriculum matrix, right? I mean, we use that as kind of our starting point in the past. And we kind of built from there. Each faculty member knew, and then it also linked between the curriculum matrix and the course itself, their learning outcomes that we identify with regards to our classes. And so that was like the focus. And we allowed for each faculty to have control over what questions. So we don't look at each other's questions, right? We do our own little bit.
And what's your sense, Susan, of what you're learning from it?
Well, we are still learning from it. Students choose to do this. So some can do the comprehensive exam and some do a thesis. So it's kind of like a two-prong approach. So we haven't had very many do it. So right now we've only had 7 do it. So we're still in the experimental stage. We have a fairly high bar in terms of passing, right? They have to get an 80% to pass. So they have to do pretty well. The students don't like it. They're really afraid of it, I think, just because it's new. But one of the reasons why we did it is because we have a lot of students that are not getting through in the 2 years. And this was a way to kind of speed up graduation. And, there are some students that just really struggle with doing a thesis. That just eats up a lot of faculty time. Sorry, but this is the reality. And we do have a course that aligns with the exam. So we familiarize them with the structure of the exam. We spend time on that, and then the different faculty go in and we are assigned at least one class session with the students. And if they want, so we kind of, give them a refresher over the material, tell them how, kind of give them some guidance as to what the exam will cover. And if they want, we have enough weeks left after that if they want one of us to come back, they can call us back, and then we can have like question and answer kinds of sessions. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's how we structured it.
Thank you, Susan. Does anyone have any questions for Susan before we go on? I'm really glad to hear about that. And I'd love to hear if others are doing exams. I'd be curious about that. I wanted to show just one other type of assessment tool, which is the idea of a portfolio. I know that some programs do this. This is more, those of you who are coming from architecture will be more familiar with this approach, where students pull together their own evidence of what it is that they've done that demonstrates those learning competencies, those student outcomes that we're interested in, and compile them. Sometimes it's connected with a system for faculty review of those and assessment of those deliverables. That happens periodically over the course of the semester. We also tried, this was part of our system that proved too cumbersome for us to do. And I have a screenshot of this portfolio system that was used at Boston College's graduate program for higher ed educators or administrators rather. And what I liked about this, and I'll give you a link to the so that you can look at this interactive website that we got permission from the student to share. And what she did was she turned it into a website that has tabs that show her own reflections about what she thinks the different competencies mean and why they're important, her own philosophy of being a higher ed administrator, with artifacts of things that she had done. And it has links also to her CV. And she uses this as part of her job search and way of promoting herself in the field as well. So I think that's another way of looking at learning outcomes. I think we've talked about, this is challenging to do. I mean, we've hit on a lot of these already. One that we haven't mentioned yet is the importance of transparency and communication to students. And I think we heard that a little bit in what Susan said about the students are not so happy about it. And part of it, what's probably happening in your department, Susan, is the more you're talking about it and maybe discussing with them, is this useful for making sure that you are yourselves learning? The more that we're doing that and engaging in conversations with faculty and with students about it, the better able we'll get more hearty participation in designing and doing it. We have found that for the rubrics that we attach to the classes, that's helped us communicate with the students about what we're having them use the assignments to do to promote their learning. So that with respect to the learning in progress, we found that that's really useful. And I think that we have more to learn about how do we do this kind of learning assessments in a way that involves the principles of participation that we care about in ways that we do planning, in the way that we do assessment. This is the last slide, and I think we have a little bit of time for us to digest some of this with respect to your own programs. That here is a framework for the design process, that you start with setting the goals about which are the student learning outcomes you want to prioritize in your assessment. The PAB for accreditation has whatever system there that is in process right now of how we are to report on the standards. But each of us in our programs can decide where we're putting most of our energy, which are the ones that are most important to us. That discussion about that may be one of the big value gains for our programs about thinking about what our students are learning. And we want to design the approach of how will we include some direct observations as well as other types of observations or other types of data collection to assess whether that learning is happening. What kinds of instruments do we want to use? Keeping in mind, what do you have the faculty resources and buy-in to do? You can experiment. We abandon some. You can introduce and see how it goes and change that as you move along. You want to think about who's going to do it and how do you do it in a way that is less taxing. Using the learning management systems, we've started to do that now so that it's very easy to download and aggregate. Survey similarly, download and aggregate it. It's something that takes not very long for us to do. It sounds like the mechanism that Susan is using for the exam really leans into the functionalities of those learning systems. But the question is, who's going to be charged with doing that? Distributing that across the different faculty who are charged with learning in those courses, where it's part and parcel of what they're already doing is one strategy for that. How are you going to do the analysis and then the interpretation of the data? What we're finding is the conversations that we have in the faculty, in faculty groups or in the full faculty periodically, once every other year, whatever, however it is that we're doing it, or when a decision is coming up that we have to make about, are we going to permanently abandon GRE scores or not? we can turn to some of this, and that helps us ground our discussion. And plans for using the findings. It's good to think about that in advance. How do we focus on what's going to, when we're thinking about our assessment? Let's not try to do everything. Let's try to do the things that are going to be useful for reporting, but more importantly, for what we're trying to do with our curriculum, how we're going to guide our teaching. So there's a final thing in the chat, I mean, in the Google Doc. Do we have questions before we go? If we'll take some time to do a little bit of small group debriefing of what you're going to do. But are there any questions that are lingering before we do that? Do we have any? Okay, so why don't we go to the number 4 in the chat. And in your breakout room, share some thoughts, some takeaways from this that you might return to your department and put into practice. And we'll hear a little bit about it. So like take maybe 4 or 5 minutes in your group to talk about it. I've put 3 prompts about discernible measurement mechanism strategies you might use, the challenges you anticipate for collecting, and the challenges you anticipate for analyzing, interpreting, or making use of it. And I'll put you in the same breakout rooms you were in before. Hi, welcome back. I think we're all back again. I'm hoping that those conversations that you had in those rooms are some good start to wrestling with how might you approach this in your departments? Who might you enlist to be partners in thinking about this some more with your colleagues, and raising the questions about how do you do this in a way that hones in on what is most meaningful and useful and feasible for you to do, hooking it into what you're already doing in your classes. That's part of the lesson that we learn, that the more that we're doing that, the easier it is for us to do this. And we also learned that the more, strangely, the more specific we are in the criteria, the easier it is to link it across courses. And we can combine the scores for that really easily by summing them up or thinking about the qualitative stuff together in groups. So that was a response to that. When there's so much data and so many indicators, sometimes it's easier to parse it out into many and then acknowledge we're going to think about all of these at once. And you can collapse those into ratings if that proves useful, or you have a conversation about the richness of it. So any other comments that people want to make before we say goodbye? Suggestions to one another about what to do, what not to do? Came up in the groups. Well, I hope that at least the talking about it in the groups and thinking about it as you're participating today gives you the courage to convince your colleagues that this doesn't have to be scary and meaningless, that you can own it and do what's useful for you. And we've put in the chat, I believe, a template that is essentially what a lot of what we've done today that you can use for your thinking together with your colleagues in your programs to do this work in the way that suits you at another time. In the Google Doc and in that Word document that was put in the chat are some links to additional resources, including that values framework of the rubrics that I mentioned earlier. It includes also the Ph.D.'s materials. And I would love to hear more examples like what we heard from Susan or other things that you're doing. And maybe if people are interested, I'd also love to hear if anybody would like to, if we can get together and think about some criteria and strategies for doing what's meaningful and useful and feasible together. I would love to do that because we need to do that too in our program. And I just want to underscore, none of this involves shoulds. They're all suggestions for you to take off with and think about what do you do, in what way is really suitable for your programs, your priorities, your resources, your dedication. And by priorities, I mean all the other things you have to do too.
And I just wanted to thank Laurie so much for giving this presentation. I thought it was really informative, and we've gotten some really great feedback in the chat. So thank you so much for taking time to do this for us.